and welcome to Taiwan Talks. I'm Ian Kavat. Following Emmanuel Macron's comments about Taiwan and the United States, we ask, is this just the tip of the iceberg? Is US influence starting to wane? And with it, support for Taiwan? But first, the United States is still scrambling after the leak of top-secret military intelligence, allegedly by a 21-year-old US airman. Like other US friends and competitors, Taiwan didn't come off unscathed. The Washington Post, which accessed the highly sensitive documents, said although the material didn't provide a complete picture of Taiwan and China's abilities, they painted a grimmer picture of Taiwan's overall readiness. Responding to that report is our first guest, Tony Hu, who has worked closely with the Taiwan military for more than 25 years. During that time, he was a former US Department of Defense Senior Director of China, Taiwan and Mongolia. I spoke to him earlier. Let's take a look. Tony, is Taiwan highly vulnerable to an attack from China?
The leaked document that was published, many of its assumptions, assessment is based on Taiwan fighting alone. And the grim picture that it painted is based on the assumption that Taiwan is fighting alone. If you take everything into consideration, maybe that picture isn't so grim.
One of the things the documents covers is about early warning of an invasion. Would Taiwan get enough warning?
United States intelligence, unfortunately, we depend a lot on our technical methods, satellite and intercepts and stuff. Taiwan has a very strong human intelligence capability in China. So,
did you say in China?
In China, yeah.
How does that work?
Well, it's not a secret that Taiwan has spies in China, okay? And when you combine this human intelligence with technical intelligence of the United States, I fully believe there will be sufficient strategic warning to allow both the United States to forward deploy and also for Taiwan to get ready.
And yet the documents quote a Taiwanese who doubted that the air defenses were enough. Why is that?
Right. That particular portion was addressed in terms of, I believe, missile defense. Taiwan's ability to detect missile launches from China. I'm not sure these particular officers had the complete knowledge about Taiwan's missile defense system. Because Taiwan has very robust missile defense system and has the ability to detect launches early on, and not only detection of launches but also detection, immediate calculation of impact points, and so Taiwan has a pretty good missile defense. Also, I think one point people should think about is, right, China has 1,200 short-range missiles they can use against Taiwan and 300 medium-range missiles that they can use against Taiwan. That's 1,500 missiles. That, however, is a number that is not a true capability because these missiles need to have a launcher in order to be shot. How many launchers is the key? China has less than 500 launchers. That means if every single one of those launchers is called transporter, erector, launcher. If every one of them carry a missile that works, that first wave will be less than 500 missiles. Taiwan has a lot more missiles that can be used to intercept these. If you add up the number of Patriots, you add up the number of TK3s, Taiwan has a lot of missiles, and Taiwan's intercept missile only has to intercept those that's going to hit at a location that is valuable.
Let's go to China taking control of the skies early on. What would this mean? Do you believe it will happen?
It is also accurate. The assessment is accurate because China has 4 times more aircraft than Taiwan. And the assessment is accurate in saying in the early stages of the war, because China has so many aircraft and they will be able to overwhelm Taiwan's sky just by pure numbers.
Are you saying that this is not a surprise?
It's not a surprise. Nobody should be surprised by that. It's just overwhelming force. However, once the coalition forces arrive, that will turn. That the control of the sky will be contested, then the control of the sky, I fully believe, will belong to the coalition forces.
let's turn now to Port of Taipei. It was mentioned in the documents, and in the documents it said that Taiwan has not practiced defending it. And yet, I do recall that Taiwan's Hanguang military exercises last year actually had this as a scenario for a decapitation attack.
Absolutely. Taipei Port has been identified as a center of gravity for the defense of Taiwan for many years, just because its location and how convenient it is if China use a civilian ro-ro ship, get close to Taipei Port, stay outside of Taiwan's territorial water, but once the missile strike starts, they come moving in and offload heavy armors and stuff and do basically a quick strike against Taipei to achieve political surrender versus having do all this amphibious landing in the central and southern Taiwan and fight their way up to get a military surrender. So this is what Putin tried to do in Kyiv, try to get into the capital and get a political surrender. So the defense of Taipei Port, I am certain, is in the MND's plan, and they have a way, and it would not be so easy for China to try to grab that port intact and be able to use it for their purpose.
So what does it say to you, Tony, that the documents say something which is blatantly incorrect?
Yeah, yes, I suspect they might not know this scenario has been played out during Hanguang. It has Taiwan has exercised in the defending that port. Like I said, any military strategists look at that and say that's center of gravity for both sides. So it has to be either held or destroyed. If Taiwan can hold it, I suspect Taiwan will destroy it, so China can't use it.
Tony Hu, thank you so much for your time today.
Thank you.
That was Tony Hu speaking to me earlier. Now, a French delegation has arrived in Taiwan for a 4-day visit, just days after the uproar following Emmanuel Macron's statements. The French president said the EU should not simply follow the US and not get drawn into a Taiwan conflict.
According to us, nothing changed. What we want to say to Taiwan is if something happens to Taiwan, it will change the world. I don't want to spend my week to clarify any malentendu. There's no malentendu between France and Taiwan.
And Germany's Foreign Minister Annalena Baerbock wrapped up her China visit, seen by some as the EU's attempt to mop up the foreign policy disaster created by Macron. From there, Baerbock travelled to the G7 Foreign Ministers Summit in Japan. This is what she had to say about US support and the Indo-Pacific.
Wir Europäer konnten angesichts der russischen Aggression auf die Solidarität anderer Partner weltweit zählen. Solidarität darf nie eine Einbahnstraße sein. Unsere Partner müssen auf uns zählen können. Das gilt gerade für den Indo-Pazifik, eine, wenn nicht die Region, in der sich entscheiden wird, wie die internationale Ordnung im 21. Jahrhundert aussieht.
And there was this on China.
Dort spüren viele unserer Partner bereits heute hautnah, wie China immer mehr die bestehenden, allgemeinen, verbindlichen internationalen Regeln durch seine eigenen Regeln ersetzen will. Gerne mit der Behauptung, es gäbe keine Regeln, obwohl man die Verträge selbst ratifiziert hat.
Annalena Baerbock, Germany's foreign minister, with me to discuss how Baerbock's visit may have smoothed over the Macron fallout are Raymond Sung, Deputy CEO of the Taiwan New Constitution Foundation, and Zsusza Ferenczy, National Donghua University Assistant Professor and Institute of Security and Development Policy in Sweden Associate Research Fellow. Raymond and Zsusza, very warm welcome to the show today.
Thank you.
If I could bring Zsusza in there. In your view, did Annalena Baerbock smooth over any of the controversy created by Macron? Did she address any of it, either in a message to China or a message to the US?
Well, I believe that she was very clear and strong in her message, saying that the use of force is unacceptable and that this is very much in line with the German position, and it's also in line with the European position that we've seen come out of Brussels for the past 2, 3, 4 years. And this is in line of this recalibration of the German foreign policy and Germany's views of its own role in the Indo-Pacific. So it's very important to see all of this in the context of the Indo-Pacific. And I believe that the problem we face is inconsistent communication and messaging from different European leaders who do not stand on the same line when it comes to these important issues. And when we deal with China, we have to finally understand that we cannot let Beijing exploit our differences. We have, and we will always have our differences, and we will never really speak with one voice. That's not the point of the European Union. That's what Washington can do, and that's what Beijing can do for itself. But the EU is 27 countries. We will always have our differences. So what we need to do, and where we have made progress, is that we have been coordinating. Of course, the recent example is not a good example of coordination, because what French President did in Beijing, and after leaving Beijing, did not send the right message. It undermined the message that the European President Commission had.
Absolutely, yeah.
And this is doing damage long term.
Okay, let me bring in Raymond there. So I think this is precisely what the issue is, isn't it? Is, you know, Annalena Baerbock needed to go there, needed to show the unity that Zsusza mentioned. However, Macron, has he stepped out of line in terms of messaging? We seem to agree that he has. And yet, I'll quote what she said: Macron once again emphasized that France's China policies reflected EU-China policies one-on-one, or one-to-one. What does that mean? Is she saying that what he said is in line or not in line with the EU?
Actually, whatever President Macron has said, actually being contradicted by various actors, not only within the European Commission or in the European countries. And I really don't know what that particular phrase is. But the problem, the problem for me is that whether the European countries are really committed to the escalation, not only to deter China. Of course, I know that China is a big power, and it's an influential power, and it's a very fluent power, and much economies of European countries are dependent on or interlinked with China. I know all that. But the question remains that how do we deal with China, given that it's so big? Whether we could, there are several possibilities. One is to contain China, to restrain them from acting in a direction which will lengthen the war rather than shorten the war. And further, whether they can get some support from China to influence Vladimir Putin to get a deal and get to a ceasefire point, or get to the negotiating table, or whether you will throw up some meat to the alliance, for example, to say that Taiwan is not our business and that's only for China to resort to. And there are several possibilities. But there is concrete steps to be taken following those strong words. We appreciate those. But aside from deterrence, strong wording, and showing them by force, or there's some de-escalation of tensions effort could be made. And of course, on that part, the diplomatic cloud of European countries could exert some positive influence on China, or at least to contain China.
And Raymond has mentioned before that, you know, the US support for Europe in the Ukraine, you know, is significant, is crucial. So, Zsusza, if you can address the comments by Baerbock about, you know, solidarity is not a one-way street. Tell me about why it's important to send a message to the US.
Well, I will address that question, but I think I can link it to the previous comments that Raymond made, because I think we need to see the big picture here. The China policy that French president claimed to represent and to address on his trip to Beijing has a lot of elements in it. And there's elements that all EU member states have embraced, and that is the economic security, which we have not really touched upon yet, but is closely linked to what is happening around Taiwan. So we did actually, but not directly. So there we also need to be very clear that there are a lot of elements in the EU's foreign policy vis-a-vis China that have really the support of all member states. And on that point, I think French president's vision for Europe to build a strong Europe is very important and is needed. How we're going to get there is probably where member states will diverge most. But we need to remember that the de-risking policy and agenda that the President of the Commission has clearly put forward, which unfortunately Macron did not embrace as much, even though France has been one of the greatest supporters of de-risking our relations with China, together with the Germans and Italy. It goes back years that they have been pushing for an anti-coercion instrument and trade defense instruments. So we need to remember that all of these instruments are there. We are moving slowly. And this is important that we're doing this in partnership with our allies. So this is where I would then turn to the United States, because that's also very clear, in spite of whatever comments Macron made, that for the EU, the US remains a key ally, our most important partner. And this language is fully embraced by all member states. And I know it is also true for France. So we need to be always a little mindful of the context, of the nuances. And I think no one should doubt that should something happen in this region where we sit right now, where Taiwan faces this existential crisis, that there will be a coordination between democracies. I don't have any doubt about that. Of course, how and in what way the EU will help its allies in this regard, if its allies face the bigger threat or the initial threat. It's very clear for the EU that we have more than 1/3 of our exports come to this region, our biggest trade partners.
My next guest is Mo Sobel, an assistant professor of diplomacy and international relations at Tamkang University. I spoke with him earlier. Let's take a look. Professor Sobel, can I ask you, were Macron's interviews more of the same on strategic autonomy?
I don't think so. If we look at Macron's visit to China and the comments that came afterwards, I think they more represent the tendency of French leaders to punch above their weight. And that's because they feel that they or France should play a bigger role in international politics, and also because they feel frustrated from the fact that Europe and France are in an inferior position and need the support of the US. And this tendency is more of a century old.
So did you dispute the fact that the strategic autonomy comments are not what he's been saying for years?
Well, they are, but I think that when you look actually at his actions, they are similar to actions that were taken before by French leaders, be it de Gaulle, Chirac, Mitterrand, and it's less about strategic autonomy and just more the need of France to go back to the glory days. And actually, we don't have to go that far to First World War. Surely you could recall the visit of President Macron to Russia just before the war, where he was sure, or he was thinking that he will be the one who will persuade Putin to back off. And unfortunately, that did not happen. So usually this tendency lead at best that it won't work, but at worst that it will be counterproductive, like the case that we are discussing now.
And what did you make of his comments on Taiwan?
Well, I think it was simply a poor choice of words. Yes, I don't think that he gave a green light for China to attack. I think he simply tried to, take a very modest approach. Surely it's not that Europe, in case China invades, will put boots on the ground. And surely the meaning here is not that President Macron will threaten President Xi that the French army is coming in case China makes a move. But what a lot of people expect to happen was that he will be much more persistent and present a unified approach together with the President of the European Commission, saying to China, listen, you have to understand that if you support Russia or if you break the status quo across the Taiwan Strait, there will be consequences. And it's also important to bear in mind that Europe is very, very important to China. It's not that It's just that Europe depends on China. For China, Europe actually
is one of the biggest trading partners. And so what you're saying is that Europe also has leverage.
Europe has
China
leverage. The
and
problem
should be
is using it. Yeah.
Yes. And so on that point, you know, Macron basically was saying that the EU should not be dragged into the conflict over Taiwan, and that it's not a crisis of Europe. What do you make of that comment in terms of, you know, as you said, he's meant to be aligning with fellow Europeans, aligning with the US in terms of deterrence, I guess, against China?
Well, I think that that's his opinion. It's not the opinion of EU institutions. It's not the opinion of other EU member states. One might say that it's not even the opinion within France and with the French security establishment. That's definitely not the opinion of the US and other allies in the so-called like-minded countries alliance. Regarding deterrence, well, deterrence is important. Yeah, if it takes the informal form of strategic ambiguity or the more formal and direct form of NATO and Article 5. So I disagree with the assessment that deterrence increases tension. There are plenty of examples to prove otherwise.
And I just want to quote what he said about accelerating a Taiwan crisis. He said, you know, the question Europeans need to answer is it in our interest to accelerate crisis on Taiwan? No, the worst thing would be to think that we Europeans must be followers of the US, take our cue from the US agenda and a Chinese overreaction. Do you see in that he's putting more blame on the US for a Taiwan crisis?
Yeah, that definitely fits to the Chinese narrative. You could say that those kind of comments, it's a French interview with Chinese characteristics. So China was very happy about it, and you could see that state-run media outlets like Global Times happily embraced those kind of comments.
That and strategic autonomy itself. Yeah.
Yes, but at the end of the day, the EU and Ukraine need the US. And while the Americans are more than happy for Europe to strengthen their military capabilities, yes, that was always the objective of the EU in order to defend Europe and the European periphery, and also to share the security burden of being the global police officer. The US and Washington certainly do not agree to this kind of terminology, especially nowadays when Ukraine and Europe desperately need American support to defend Ukraine. And that's also why Central and Eastern European countries were not too shy to use a very undiplomatic language to criticize Macron. Because after all, it's not the alliance with France or even EU membership that protect those countries. It's the US and the security umbrella provided by US-led NATO.
Yes, and you know, we talked about deterrence, and this is a very important aspect, I guess, of the alliance of the US looking to their allies and partners, especially in trying to deter China against Taiwan. It was reported that Macron was happy that the Chinese waited until he was out of Chinese airspace before starting the drills on Taiwan. What message does this send?
Well, I bet he was very happy about it. But I don't think, again, that it is about Macron giving China a green light for steps of aggression. Yeah.
So it doesn't appear to be condoning that aggression?
No, but I think that some might say it was a clever move by the Chinese. It was simply to save face. Yes, because for China, the visit of Macron was successful. What's the point of complicate things? Yes, if the drills would have started earlier, that would have put Macron and for the land in a very difficult position that they would need, or they would be forced to criticize China while being in China. So it will be a difficult position for them and embarrassing to China.
But the dust had hardly settled. I mean, maybe that's an issue of you know, inches. Can the French delegation, which has come to Taiwan, Can it repair some of the damage, do you think, that's been made by Macron?
To be honest, I don't think so. Well, certainly it might ease the concerns of the Taiwanese public or the Taiwanese authorities.
In sort of isolating Macron himself?
Well, just to show that the French legislators think otherwise and that the position of France did not change, yeah, even after Macron said what he said. But looking at the bigger picture, and with all the respect to Taiwan, the bigger picture is European unity and transatlantic partnership and the like-minded alliance and the challenge of confronting China. Yeah, and here I think that it's important to bear in mind that soon this interview will be forgotten and we'll move on to the next political crisis. And what I'm trying to say here is, with or without the interview, many countries do have a problem to present a unified front vis-a-vis China and other authoritarian regimes.
Professor Mo Sobol, thank you for joining Taiwan Talks.
Thank you very much.
That was Mo Sobol speaking with me earlier. Raymond, so to see if all this marks sort of greater global shifts, it's interesting that Fumio Kishida, who is hosting Japan is hosting the G7 Foreign Ministers Summit right now in Japan. He had toured European capitals in 2022 ahead of assuming the presidency of G7. And one of his clear messages was, as you were saying, that the security of or essentially Europe and Asia are linked.
Yes.
And this was repeated by European leaders too, since essentially the start of the European war. So do Europeans actually believe this to be true?
I hope so. I really hope so. I hope that the constantly reminders to those leaders is that what the world vision is put after the World War II, after the lessons learned from the terrible war arising from the expansionist leaders and dictatorship, which is not to be repeated. And in the United Nations Charter, the indivisibility of peace and security and respect for rule of law and the respect for human rights was bound together, which constitute the essential elements to international order. So it is also very essential, crucial for us to realize in the present world which powers are breaching those visions and the common system of value. And clearly, it's if you've taken some international standard into consideration, clearly they are Russia and China, because the use of force has to be justified, and you cannot invade an independent country. And in the Indo-Pacific, you cannot violently violate the status quo without giving respect to the wishes of Taiwanese people. So those kind of ambition need to be contained, need to be repressed.
And also there's the partnership between the two, which makes it even more interconnected, right?
And of course, and there are several aspects of the deterrence. One is military and defensive, the other is economic and trade and generally solidarities that we stand together. For example, people are talking about the different degrees of resistance to sanctions on Russia and on China. And also, if we bring into additional element, which is Russia gets its allies like China to support it to build up a better system to exert its coercive power and to make it more resistant to the sanctions, which is very clear that it's not that the European countries are allying with the United States against China, which is not the story. That seemed to be suggested in the Macron statements. And it's really that European countries are making policies to defend its own interest, which is a common, the maintenance of the international order and to deter the unlawful war, no matter in Ukraine or possibly in Taiwan Strait.
Zsusza, however, saying all that, let's look into whether Macron's comments actually reflect others in Europe, or even more broadly. Germany's Chancellor, Olaf Scholz, has written about the third way. in a piece where he talked about Zeitenwende. So, do these positions actually have influence in Europe or even beyond?
Well, the European Union is a diverse international organization with lots of different views, but there is an emerging convergence on the need, on understanding that there's a need to have common tools to be able to defend our own interests. And when we look at the Indo-Pacific and we connect that, it's very clear, and the language out of Brussels really states that very clearly, that going forward we need to be able to have more autonomy to act and not allow countries such as authoritarian regimes such as China or Russia to limit that space that we have to act internationally. So economic security is very important, and resilience is very important. And this is why I think partnering with countries in the region, in this region, in the Indo-Pacific, where China's coercion has been most serious, is very important. And I think that's real, that is happening, and the views on that are converging. The EU is building partnerships, digital partnerships, trade and technology partnerships with all members or democratic countries in the Indo-Pacific, and this is going forward. So this is positive, and I do not think that this is in contrast with comments that were made earlier that we need to do this alone. I mean, the partnership is, as a concept, at the heart of everything we do on the global stage. And that is because of the economic interdependence. So that is why decoupling is not an option, is not realistic, and it doesn't help anyone. But I think it's important, again, to go back to the same thought that it is important for the EU to be able to act and take its own decisions.
Raymond, does comments by Scholz, Macron, who does not represent the EU, do they, however, reflect maybe the thoughts of leaders around the world who simply don't want to pick between China and the US?
Yes, I think there are several levels. Of course, on the very real pragmatic level, that the defense in Europe are largely reliant on the US forces and supplies. And so in that sense, of course, the European countries are relatively in a not so favorable position to be a bloc. But as Professor Sobel just said, actually the thoughts are there. The thoughts, actually, those comments made by President Macron or Chancellor Scholz represent some people thinking that Europe should pursue that way, and no matter how pragmatic it is. And that has some legacies in the big power politics in the previous ages. But I will argue that in the present world, another paradigm is more suitable to see all those affairs, which is the alliance of democratic countries in defense of their common values system and their common interest, and if necessary, to show force to make deterrence effective. In that, European countries can take their own positions, no matter through their economic clouds and influences, or through their diplomatic forces, to support those values, and of course, including, for example, German chancellors said that it will raise the defense spending to the 2% GDP level, which is a good sign that European countries are awakening to the real politics at play, no matter at doorsteps or in Indo-Pacific, which is a very real threat. And democratic countries should stand together in solidarity and take some concrete actions. And so I'm afraid that's the voice that we should unify ourselves and be voicing. And rather than a more other kind of messages will send us wrong signals to China. So that's what I am afraid I worried about.
Okay. Yeah, Zsusza. So on that point.
Well, on that point, I think it's important to remember that President Macron is not alone to say that the EU should not be forced to choose sides. And that is the reality that for years, the High Representative of the EU, Josep Borrell, has also laid out clearly.
And he's also said, I mean, just last year, he said, look, China keeps saying that we're blindly following the US. However, we're not. We're following them because we believe in it.
Well, the reality is that even though there is emerging convergence understanding the security risks, the reality is that China remains a key economic player in the region. So pulling together democratic countries, I think that's going forward, and I think the EU is very much a partner in that. But we cannot ignore the reality, and which is why a lot of the countries do not want to choose sides. And that goes for countries in Southeast Asia, ASEAN, that goes for India, countries, Turkey, countries that want to choose the way they want to go forward. They want to balance because they have to balance. So what we're saying long term is not feasible in the short run, right? Because of that economic interdependence. So what we need to do is really what President of the Commission said, is that we need to de-risk. We need to reduce dependencies in critical areas such as rare earth materials and in critical infrastructure. But we need to try to talk to China because global issues cannot be dealt without China.
So for China, what does Macron's comments, and strategic autonomy, which they lapped up, and which apparently they use all the time when talking about European relations, what does it all mean for Xi Jinping and China?
Well, I believe I don't claim that this is an exact translation, but I think one of the comments after President Macron's visit was that spring has arrived, which means that this is good news for China. As long as Beijing can deal with individual member states.
So to pick them off, maybe individual, which is
yes.
one of their strategies.
Indeed, this is the strategy.
Yeah. So Raymond, what's in it for China? When you have the countries that say they want to be strategically autonomous, but as we mentioned, that's what every sovereign country can be.
May I say this? I have all the respect of the different views taken on China. Of course, people see China in different ways, in different views, and of course, some people also hope that China is so much important to the global economy. And that it will be a peaceful power, and it will have the peaceful rising. But for us, and not everybody will take sides and take behind the lines that the U.S. Majority influence is taken, which is a more hardline policy. And having said that, we say, as a Taiwanese observer, we understood what the nature of the Chinese power and what's the dictatorships of Xi Jinping's regime implicated for us. Not only for us, also for Hong Kong people, for Xinjiang, for Tibetan people. And what are we going to, what does that, all those rooms still has to live to China will lead to? And all those 30 years that has Chinese mainland develop a liberal democracy, or leading to a more dictatorship, and whether there is more disruptive to the international order, for example, to the South China Seas countries, to Australians, which do nothing to offend China, but have to suffer from economic sanctions. What's the implication for the rising of China, which we have to think about? We in Taiwan, we know what's inside the Communist Party of China, and we know the nature of, and we know their political agenda. So we have fundamental disagreement with them, not only on our security, but on our value system. We need what has to be get rid of. If this world is not going to get rid of the CCP, there's no peace. So we don't have to, for us, at least for people who has come to that kind of realization, we don't need to more. Of course, we have to talk with them, but we don't have to still leave too much room for them. We need to take a stronger position, which is what we believe.
Okay, Zsusza, final question. Some analysts say that if Europe doesn't work with the US, then China will become the dominant power. Do you think that could happen? And if so, in that sort of world, could Europe become a third superpower?
Well, I believe that the EU will work with Washington, and I don't really have doubts there. I don't think we have the option, and I don't think we actually want to do that. There's no desire to weaken the links that link us to Washington. We've learned in the past year that the situation in Ukraine that Russia has caused and continues, that China also continues not to condemn, requires that we stand together. And it also requires us to look beyond our own borders and to really be more mindful that what is happening in our own region and the implications of the outcome of the situation of the war in Ukraine will have global implications. So that's where I think Taiwan clearly comes into the picture. And it's not a new development. We have started looking at Taiwan from the European perspective before China has become as aggressive as it has been in the recent past. So I think going forward, the transatlantic relationship will have to strengthen, but I think both sides need to understand the complexities and the interest of each other. I think what Europeans do not like is to be told what to do, and I think Washington needs to understand that, and I think we need to have that sort of very clear conversation that actually we agree on economic security, we do agree on democratic resilience, the need to build up deterrence. But how we get there, we also need to have our own voice. And I think that's very important when we think of the implications in the global south.
Okay.
That's good. That's very good.
Raymond Sung and Zsusza Ferenczy, thank you so much for joining Time with Me today. And finally, to get an idea of how the Macron controversy is being received in France, our host and editor Rath Wang spoke with Francois Zhizhang-Wu, Taiwan's representative to France. Let's take a look.
How much is the French public concerned about comments directed at Taiwan, saying that France does not have to follow the U.S. if conflict breaks out in the Strait?
I think this position have been strongly criticized in France, but I try to say that Taiwan and France still have a lot of topic to work together, especially in terms of democracy and liberty. And a lot of public opinion is saying that in terms of this kind of universal value, France just need to try to find his own way to continue to support the liberty and the democracy. Taiwan and France still have a lot of things to do together. France will immediately send a delegation of the National Assembly, and before the end of this month, the Senate also will send a delegation to Taiwan.
Ambassador, what about in terms of coercion towards Taiwan?
They are very afraid that China, as the second economic power of the world, actually use their economic power, force France or Europe change their politics or even to change their position. France society, the French society actually is very concerned about this topic.
Ambassador, you mentioned delegations coming, but there's also been a warship that's come through the Taiwan Strait. What message does this send?
In France, they're also talking about this frigate crossing the Taiwan Strait just after the visit of Emmanuel Macron in China. So here they are saying that look, it is just a manifestation to show that France is still defending the liberty of navigation in the Taiwan Strait. Here, in general, it is very well interpreted to try to show that the politics of France toward the region didn't change.
What support can we expect from France if China, in the rare case, invades Taiwan?
The one very important thing that everyone needs to know, in terms of geography, France is a European country that is the nearest to Taiwan, because France has the New Caledonia territory in place. So I think we just cannot separate France and the region, given the fact that Taiwan is the 14th trade power of the world. something happened between Taiwan and China just cannot be only a Chinese internal affair. So by definition, France is concerned, and especially France and Taiwan are two democratic countries, and France is defending universal value also very strongly. I just cannot imagine that if you given the fact that, for example, we have in Taiwan we have the semiconductor industry. We are a very good model of a democracy. Parliamentary relation between France and Taiwan is so well. By definition, I just think that France just cannot say that can keep away about the conflict between China and Taiwan. Some conflict happened between China and Taiwan. I believe there's no doubt that France will support Taiwan.
Ambassador, in terms of policy, do you feel anything has changed after Macron's China visit?
It has been confirmed by the French government that nothing has changed after the visit of Emmanuel Macron. The French policy toward Taiwan and toward the Taiwan Strait is a status quo. And it has been repeated several times. Government, party, parliamentary, even by government official, France oppose any changing of the relation between Taiwan and China by force. So I think the message has been very clear, and it is also the policy of Taiwan, the message that Taiwan tried to send to the world.
Ambassador, you've been extensively on French media these few days, telling Taiwan's story. Do you feel that there has been a change in terms of interest for Taiwan and defending Taiwan?
The public opinion in France defend Taiwan is just increasing. Personally, I even receive a lot of message. It's very interesting from people that I know, from friends that I know, or even from a lot of people that I even don't know. They're just sending their support to Taiwan. They said, wow, wonderful that Taiwan still resists from this authoritarian country, that means China. And especially if you look at the majority of French media, I just see a support, a very strong support every time that China show his muscle, show his aggressivity to Taiwan. The image of China is just going down, and the image of Taiwan is just going up. So I think the support is just getting stronger and stronger in France.